My name's David Cannon. I'm the chair of the Jewish Network for Palestine. This is one of a whole series of webinars that we put on, and the past webinars are available on our website if people go to Jewish Network for Palestine. So it's my job to welcome everyone today, and particularly to welcome our distinguished guest, Antony Lerman. Chaim Rashith will chair this webinar. Antony Lerman will be talking about his new book, which I am anxious to read myself and urge everyone to have a look at. So without further ado, Chaim, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's very, very heartening to see so many friends on this list and on this webinar. Now, it gives me a great and special pleasure to host and chair Antony Lerman today. Antony Lerman is a senior fellow at the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna, is an honorary fellow at Parkes Institute for the Study of Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations at Southampton University, and associate editor of Patterns of Prejudice. He was director of the Institute of Jewish Affairs between 91 and 96, then the founding director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research between 1996 and 1999, and then again at 2006 to 2009. Those of you who will read the book will find out in the introduction why there is a break in his directorship, which is a very exciting story and tells us a lot about the mensch that Antony Lerman is. He was one of the founders of Independent Jewish Voices, and he is the author of Making and Unmaking of a Zionist, a Personal and Political Journey, 2012. He is the co-author of Bad News for Labor, Antisemitism, the Party, and Public Belief, 2019. The founding editor of Antisemitism World Report between 1992 and 98. He has written on anti-Semitism, racism, and other political issues for The Guardian, Independent, Prospect, Haaretz, New York Times, New Statesman, The Nation, London Review of Books, Aufbau, Jewish Chronicle, Open Democracy, Middle East Eye, and many other publications. Now, this is the official introduction that I used. I want to say that in the ranks of research on anti-Semitism and racism, Antony really prefers me to call him Tony, which I am very happy with. Tony is the leading researcher and has been the leading researcher for a number of decades on those topics. I think that few people anywhere know and understand anything like he does on the topic. He has, more than anyone else, been at the forefront of research on anti-Semitism. He headed the most important anti-Semitism research body in Europe and arguably in the world at a time when Israel was little interested in anti-Semitism. Remember, there was such a time. Apart, of course, from seeing it as a recruiting sergeant for Aliyah, getting diaspora Jews to emigrate to Israel. Tony is the perfect academic and researcher to write a book on this topic. Now, I want, if you will allow me, to make 2 points about the book. The first one is, this is not just a history of the new anti-Semitism and the debate around it. In a sense, it is many more things. First of all, talking about the IHRA, which is at the heart of the debate, The IHRA is only one document in the series of many others which are short, supposedly insignificant, and yet are very crucial in Zionism's history. The history of Zionism is full of such documents. You would remember the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, which, due to the Russian Revolution, we know was a document by the Russian Tsarist agency, misinformation agency, I should call it. Another document, which is short and insignificant, supposedly, and actually wasn't published at the time very much, was, of course, the Balfour Declaration, a letter written by a cabinet member to a private individual, in a sense. The Lord Rothschild at the time did not enjoy a position which was official within British Zionism. And yet, think about what it achieved in the last 100 years or so. And then one could mention different documents that Ben-Gurion has penned in 1937 and 1938 that were really crucial in the history of Zionism. Now, the subtext of the IHRA is very important to understand. The hidden function of the IHRA document depends totally on a new hidden definition of Jewishness, not of anti-Semitism only, but of Jewishness. And that definition defined Jewishness as Zionism, and Zionism as Jewishness. What it constitutes and goes back to is a definition of not just the new anti-Semitism, but of the new Jew. And it's even more important. The new Jew, of course, is the Zionist, the proud, brave, militarized, fearless Jew, the total rejection of the diaspora Jew. And I want to mention a piece written originally in Hebrew called Shlilat HaGola by Amnon Raz Krakotskin, that is translated in a way into the negation of the diaspora. And there he speaks about the anti-Semitic Zionist negation of the great other of Europe, of course, the ghetto Jew. Now, what the IHRA is actually marking is a new stage in the relationship to the diasporic Jew by Zionism, from a hated and despised and negated other, the same other that anti-Semitism has chosen, Zionism has also chosen, into a new Jew. This is an Israeli in waiting, a local extension of the new Israeli power in the Middle East and its local representative. In this way, Zionism is not only a project of making history, but one of rewriting and editing history. The IHRA document is an important example of this tradition, crafted over a long period in which we used, in what we used to call smoke-filled rooms of obscure pseudo-academic committees, not exposed to the light of day and proper examination until it was complete and made irrevocable. So the book is not a pedantic history accounting the developments of the new anti-Semitism, though of course this narrative is central to the book and is there, and it's very accurately detailed. The book combines the history with historiosophy of the development of the Zionist project as it is radiating onto the outside world. While it is certainly no coffee book glossy, it is a fascinating read, an insightful foray into one of the great shibboleths of contemporary history. In this book, Tony underlines and corrects the many crude twisting of Jewish history by the Zionist state and its rampant lobby. Tony will speak for around 35 minutes, and then we shall start the Q&A session. during which we shall invite you to send your question to the chair and indicate readiness to speak using the electronic hand. Of course, you will be able to unmute if you're speaking and switch your camera on so we can see you if you choose so. Tony, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chaim. I hope everybody can hear me for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to have been invited to give this webinar, and thank you all of you participants who have joined us. I'm very flattered that so many people are interested in this book and hopefully in the ideas that it contains. So let me get stuck in to this story. We're all very well aware of the pernicious consequences of the redefinition of anti-Semitism in its IHRA form. Chaim has already spoken about it. You don't need me to tell you about the dire impact IHRA has had and is still having on the freedom of Palestinians to relate their history and current plight, and on the organizations and Palestinian support groups trying to defend Palestinian rights and tell the thoroughly documented reality of Palestinian existence today. What has not been well known or properly explained, and I think Chaim was mentioning this, alluding to it until now, is the historical process which has brought us to where we are, which is to a world enthralled to a definition of anti-Semitism that purports to defend Jews, but which functions as a charter justifying and promoting racism against Palestinians. The absence of such an explanation is in great part because, as Peter Beinart puts it in his very kind endorsement of my book, contemporary debate about anti-Semitism is incoherent and appalling, end quote. Feeding that debate in recent years has been a constant stream of controversies around alleged incidents of anti-Semitism in which protagonists rush to judgment on the basis of very little considered reflection on what has or has so often not occurred. So the rationale for my book is that we must look beyond these day-to-day controversies, take a longer view, and take into account the wider context, bringing to bear some new or neglected analytical approaches to our understanding of where we are now. This is a task I felt qualified to undertake, given my role that Chaim has described as active participant in the politics of and the intellectual and academic debates about anti-Semitism over the last 40-odd years, both within the mainstream organized Jewish community and subsequently as a free agent, ostracized from it. When we talk of redefinition today, we are naturally drawn to focus on IHRA, but the process of redefinition began long before the IHRA working definition came into being. What IHRA does is codify the notion of new anti-Semitism, an understanding of contemporary anti-Semitism that gained adherence from the 1980s onwards and became the new orthodoxy about anti-Semitism from the early years of the 21st century. Promoters of the idea of what they themselves and critics often call new anti-Semitism theory argue that the new and lethal anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, insufficiently acknowledged, developed largely on the left and among Muslims. This, they say, prompted a clamor for a new definition of anti-Semitism centered on Israel and serving the purpose of throwing a defensive embrace around the Jewish state to repel this alleged danger to its existence, with the state now conceived as central to Jewish identity. Without a new definition, it was said that this new anti-Semitism could not be properly combated. Where once the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism had been a question, as the new orthodoxy, it became an equals sign. Among definitions equating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism circulating at the time, particularly influential was the following, and I quote, "Classical anti-Semitism is the discrimination against, denial of, or assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members of whatever society they inhabit." It goes on, "The new anti-Semitism involves the discrimination against, denial of, or assault upon the right of the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations, with Israel as the targeted collective Jew among the nations." Now, the person responsible for this definition, you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, was Professor Erwin Kotler, the influential former Canadian Justice Minister, who began promoting this in the late 1980s and who remains active in its promotion today. Benjamin Netanyahu is clearly a fan of this formulation and has used it many times. For example, in 2016, he said, and I quote, "We see anti-Semitism directed against individual Jews, and we also see this hatred directed against the collective Jew, against the Jewish state. Israel is targeted with the same slurs and the same libels that were leveled against the Jewish people since time immemorial," end quote. Kotler, I should mention, was recently appointed patron of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, which you may or may not have heard of, headed by the UK's most prominent disseminator of new anti-Semitism theory, the Goldsmiths academic David Hirsch. Now, I was a critic of new anti-Semitism from my earliest encounter with the idea back in the mid-1980s. In 2002, in Prospect magazine, I argued that, and I quote, "Being based on the notion that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, it drains the word anti-Semitism of any useful meaning, because to count as an anti-Semite, it is sufficient to hold any view ranging from criticism of Israeli government policies to denial that Israel has the right to exist as a state, without having to subscribe to any of the tropes that historians since the Second World War and before have traditionally regarded as making up an anti-Semitic worldview," end quote. Now, while I could not have known this at the time, my critique anticipated the tenor and content of most of the Israel and Zionism related examples in the European Union Monitoring Center working definition of anti-Semitism of 2005, which, with minor amendments, became the IHRA working definition in 2016. New anti-Semitism adherents said there was a clamor for redefinition. I have to tell you, there wasn't. And there was no real evidence that efforts to combat anti-Semitism were hampered by not having a new definition. It was always essentially the political project of a small group and not the result of calm, open, academically based debate and discussion. Now, a major part of my book is devoted to tracing the historical development of the diverse cluster of institutions responsible for successfully framing opposition to the Jewish state as the principal manifestation of anti-Semitism today. I describe this using a term coined by Dr. Esther Romain in a key article in Patterns of Prejudice. She refers to the existence of an anti-new anti-Semitism transnational field of racial governance, a complex international network comprising the Israeli government, pro-Israel advocacy groups, Zionist organizations, Jewish communal defense bodies, research institutes, university departments, think tanks, sympathetic governments, and international governmental and non-governmental bodies, essentially policing and scapegoating those who would criticize Israel. It was important to reveal this history and provide a picture of its impressive institutional weight and influence. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this aspect of my book in tonight's talk, since my focus is on the concepts and discourse underpinning the work of these entities. They have been the drivers in making new anti-Semitism the default understanding of what is anti-Semitism today, so much so that for most diaspora and Israeli Jews, when they hear anti-Semitism, they think criticism of Israel. It's no longer necessary to say new. What we face is a narrative that rigidly sustains and seemingly strengthens anti-Palestinian racism and perpetuates the notion that Palestinians are the principal purveyors of anti-Semitism today. In my view, interrogating this use of language is vital for understanding what has happened to anti-Semitism and how we got to where we are today. The international field of racial governance may well be complex, but so much of the language used to sustain it is precisely the opposite: simple, catchy, emotive, manipulative. Faced with an organization with Holocaust Remembrance in its title, who is going to question anything emanating from such a body? To be seen to be casting doubt on what it says about contemporary anti-Semitism is immediately to invite accusations of anti-Semitism. Additionally, being international, it must be authoritative. And it's an alliance, which has echoes of combining with others to fight a just war. Moreover, as the IHRA working definition has become increasingly referenced virtually worldwide, we see it referred to simply as IHRA, and in the US, shamelessly popularized by being even further abbreviated as simply IRA, as in Gershwin. As they say, the devil has all the best tunes. The JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, is a worthy alternative to IHRA, but lacking its triggers and resonances, was it ever likely to compete with it in the public space? Now, I confront the power and influence of concept and discourse on a number of levels. Taking inspiration from Foucault's positing of a correlation between knowledge, discourse, and power, it resonates with the notion that discourse is a contested site of power, and whoever controls the discourse also controls what Toyn van Dyke in his 2008 book, Discourse and Power, conceptualizes as the public mind, and in turn is able to exercise a level of control over people's actions. Dyke claims that such high levels of control equate to an abuse of power that must be exposed. And it is abuse of power in relation to new anti-Semitism that I endeavor to expose in my book. First and foremost, as signaled in the subtitle, is what I call the myth of the collective Jew. The collective Jew being a seductive metaphor for the Jewish state, which is fundamental to new anti-Semitism. Also sustaining both the notion of new anti-Semitism itself and the collective Jew concept and metaphor are 5 other discourses: apocalypticism, eradication discourse, war discourse, medical analogies, and the demonizing of human rights values and culture. Now, in describing Israel as the targeted collective Jew among the nations, the Jewish state is the individual Jew writ large, a simple and apparently persuasive and appealing formulation. Nevertheless, seductive metaphor and concept it may be, it fails on at least 5 levels. First, it's a category mistake. A state cannot possibly have the attributes of a person. It cannot experience anti-Semitism. To claim that it can is the ascription of a property to a thing that could not possibly have that property. Second, it reduces Jews to a singularity, implying that they're all the same, an obviously anti-Semitic trope. Third, it takes the starkest manifestation of anti-Semitism in action, the Jew standing naked and intrinsically innocent before the gas chamber, and exploits it by making an equivalence with the intrinsic innocence of the state, putting it beyond criticism. That may not be Holocaust denial, but undoubtedly trivialization of the Holocaust for political purposes. Fourth, it resonates with echoes of religious Judaism, yet has no basis in it. The conservative US rabbi, the late Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the leading Jewish theologians of the 20th century, who marched with Martin Luther King at Selma in 1965, warned against worshipping the 2 fundamentals of Zionism, and I quote, "Judaism is not a religion of space and does not worship the soil," he said. So too, he wrote, "the state of Israel is not the climax of Jewish history," end quote. But heed also the words of another major Jewish thinker of the 20th century, the late Hebrew University professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz, winner of the Israel Prize, Orthodox public intellectual, polymath scientist, prolific writer on Jewish thought and Western philosophy. He described Israel's conduct in the occupied territories famously as Judeo-Nazi, and argued, quote, "holding any state as a value in itself is inherently fascist, and sanctifying any piece of land, including Israel, is a form of idolatry," end quote. And he says also, Israel public discourse is shaped by the collective denial that the occupation has been Israel's political and moral catastrophe, end quote. I think today Heschel and Leibovitz would be held in breach of IHRA. Finally, the concept is also blatantly racist in another sense. It completely erases the Palestinian minority from the Israeli reality. A more glaring example of cancel culture is hard to imagine. It turns them into non-persons. How can a state be called the collective Jew when more than 20% of its citizens are Palestinians? At least in the early days of political Zionism, even Herzl envisaged a place for Arabs in the Jewish state, albeit portrayed in a grossly patronizing fashion by a colonial mindset, seeing them as in need of civilizing. Today's Zionism finds no place for them whatsoever in its concept of the state. So I believe when it comes down to it, there is no speech about any state that can justifiably be prohibited. Now, while the notion of Israel as the persecuted collective Jew is the unstable rock on which the edifice of new anti-Semitism is built, and is also the unstated fundamental assumption behind the IHRA working definition, it depends for its influence on the other discourses I mentioned earlier. And just as the collective Jew notion must be subjected to searching critique, the same applies to them too. We're presented with these discourses as if they're the unarguable truth. They cannot be questioned. Keir Starmer's injunction that whosoever casts doubt on the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are themselves guilty of anti-Semitism is a product of the same mindset, I think. Understandable sensitivity about anti-Semitism results in many who pose critical questions about these discourses succumbing to this kind of intimidation. In finding an appropriate way of challenging these ways of thinking, or perhaps propagandizing is a more appropriate word, I found the work of Gil Anijar, I'm sure many of you know of him, immensely helpful. Professor and chair of religion, comparative literature in Middle Eastern, South Asian and African studies at Columbia University, Anijar writes as someone mobilized to fight against anti-Semitism, but is deeply perplexed about many aspects of this struggle, asking and re-asking in a couple of important articles such questions as, what is this fight exactly? Am I participating in a collective endeavor? Is there at all an organized movement against anti-Semitism? Should there be one? And if so, what kind of movement would it be? A religious, a social, or a political movement? If it is one of these, can there be such a movement, a collective or social movement that does not know itself? Is there a war against anti-Semitism? And if there is, what precisely am I in this fight? End quote. As Anijar piles question upon question and largely fails to find answers, it soon becomes apparent that this is a very effective form of critique. In frustration, he writes, quote, there is a nearly complete lack of public self-reflection on the part of the thinkers, writers, militants, and leaders of WAS, as he calls it, War Against Anti-Semitism. He continues, we are soldiers of a peculiar army that does not think itself, participants in a war that may know its enemies or think it does, but hardly its allies, end quote. Crucially, if the war is a political and social movement, Anijar expects that its leaders would, quote, vocally proclaim its affinity with, its centrality in the spread of democracy and freedom, its tendency towards realizing equality or towards crystallizing privilege. But he leaves the matter tantalizingly hanging in the air. Nonetheless, the answer is easy to come by. Statements by the war's leaders are replete with such proclamations, and yet the evidence suggests precisely the opposite. The war's principal victims are the Palestinians, denied democracy, freedom, and equality, and they aren't the only victims. The war on anti-Semitism is essentially an elite enterprise dominated by governing structures and official bodies. It's not a social movement. There are no grassroots clamoring or mobilizing for action. Its leaders expect to address and influence establishments, security forces, governments. They're accountable to no one. The war's sources of funding are not transparent. It relies on the fact that Jews do count. Now, coming to the other discourses, I start with apocalypticism. Turning to these forms of discourse that reinforce the collective Jew discourse, we start with this one. Repeated dire predictions about the consequences of alleged rampant anti-Semitism, including mass exodus of Jews from their home countries, murderous violence on the streets of Western cities, the imminent repeat of the Holocaust, but most seriously, of course, the ever-present alleged threat of annihilation of Israel by hostile Islamic forces. Such language is seen as clear justification for sustaining this fight. The headlines, news headlines, always tell us that anti-Semitism is getting worse, constantly claiming that it has never been this bad since the Holocaust. But the evidence backing the need such warnings is very hard to come by. And if the apocalyptic claims are questioned, it's the questioner who comes under suspicion for downplaying anti-Semitism. Prominent academics like Kotler and the late Robert Wistrich have consistently prophesied the worst for decades, and yet they were and never have been called to account. Their followers continue to hold them in high esteem. Next, we come to war discourse. Now, I've been using the word war to describe the campaign against anti-Semitism, not because I think it's appropriate, merely because its generals and troops use it. From the time that the Israeli state fully assumed leadership of the effort to combat anti-Semitism in the early 2000s, use of the word war to characterize the nature of its enterprise became more common. And it's no coincidence that this coincided with President George Bush's proclamation of the war on terror on 20 September 2001, following 9/11. The justification for using war discourse to describe the task of defending the collective Jew is easy to understand, not because it's objectively appropriate, precisely the opposite. The notion of a war on terror has been subject to withering critique. First, for the absurdity of the idea that you can wage war on an abstract noun. And second, because by its very nature, terrorism can never be wholly defeated. Exactly the same applies in a war on anti-Semitism. It's also an abstract noun and is probably even more unlikely to be defeated than is terrorism, a state of affairs that suits the leaders of the war only too well. Now, that may sound ultra-cynical, but if we link the next discourse, the language of eradication, to that of war, the logic of a never-ending campaign becomes clear. For as with war, despite how ubiquitous demands are for nothing less than eradication of anti-Semitism, zero tolerance, tearing it up by its roots, Keir Starmer, an end to anti-Semitism, which was the title of a Vienna conference in November 2008, it must be defeated, words of chairman of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. These are unwaveringly maximalist demands that are utterly impossible to achieve, but they pave the way for the continuity of complaint. Whatever is done will never be enough. While this is extremely unhelpful when dealing with real anti-Semitism, when applied to the alleged anti-Semitic anti-Zionism of Palestinians, continuity of complaint is exactly what Zionism requires. And so we find ourselves in Orwellian territory where constant failure is trumpeted as success. To confuse matters even more, those who insist on nothing less than complete eradication are also often wedded to the notion that anti-Semitism is a disease, usually seen as a virus, with the implication that a cure might be possible, but rarely is one ever offered. Moreover, this implies that anti-Semitism has a will of its own and is beyond the capacity of any individual to avoid, control, or combat. As such, those infected are not really morally responsible for their actions, which turns them into victims, not perpetrators. This leads us into the bizarre position where one believes that eradication is an imperative, but also anti-Semitism is an incurable disease. Surely we're now in Alice in Wonderland territory. Now, finally, the attack on human rights values. It's not unreasonable to frame the fight against anti-Semitism as a human rights cause. After all, the post-World War II focus on human rights conventions, on endeavoring to codify human rights values in legal instruments, was in great part inspired by the commitment to prevent the recurrence of the Holocaust or any new genocidal project. And some of the key figures in this movement were Jewish jurists and politicians. It is therefore highly incongruous that the campaign to protect the collective Jew displays so many elements that run counter to human rights values. Of course, there are many working to combat real anti-Semitism who genuinely are still inspired by such values and fully realize that they must apply to Palestinians too. But for those prosecuting the war on anti-Semitism, for those who populate the transnational field of racial governance, human rights has become the enemy of Jews, and specifically the enabler of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. Thus, for them, there is no incongruity in adhering to new anti-Semitism theory, designating Palestinians, along with the left and Muslims, as responsible for it, and therefore forfeiting their right to seek justice grounded in human rights values. If there were truly a just war, its targets would not be Palestinians. It's a failing, morally dubious, miscredited enterprise. A war on anti-Semitism led by Israel is a war being fought with Zionism as the weapon. This is a contradiction in terms and an impossibility. Not only because it would mean fighting one racism with another, but also because at its very core, Zionism endorses an anti-Semitic construction of the Jew. Anti-Semitism nurtured and empowered Zionism. It was mobilized for the sake of the Zionist project. Herzl wrote in his diary, "The anti-Semites will become our most loyal friends. The anti-Semitic nations will become our allies," end quote. And in the 1930s, Ben-Gurion said, "Le malheur of the Jews was the chance of Zionism." The excellent historian Edith Zertal has described the diaspora Jew as the first other of Zionism, against which Zionism defended itself, end quote. And with this, in conclusion, I return to where I started, IHRA. Without intending to exaggerate, the Jew is once again the victim of Zionism, because by IHRA defining anti-Semitism as what it is not, free speech on Palestine, Israel, real anti-Semitism is given a free pass. Sense on anti-Semitism is undermined. It now seems that while anti-Semitism was once about who hates Jews, it is now about who Jews hate. It's a tragedy that the redefinition process has produced a charter for pursuing an anti-Palestinian agenda. From its first appearance, the notion of the new anti-Semitism was being used to progressively undermine and deprive Palestinians of opportunities to speak of the Nakba, their ongoing experience of ethnic cleansing, disposition, and apartheid, Israel's discriminatory laws that made it a racist endeavor, and to struggle for their fundamental human rights, deploying non-violent forms of protest such as BDS and rights advocacy. Already often placed in legal jeopardy for these activities, With IHRA, Palestinians now found themselves branded as the principal purveyors of anti-Semitism. And despite explicitly defined as not legally binding, IHRA has been used to open up ever more legal pathways to their cancellation. A final thought, and it is just a thought, perhaps by revealing the falsity of the collective Jew concept, we need now to proceed not to demonize or exceptionalize the reality of the Israeli state, but rather normalize our discourse about it. A normal state would accept that it must be answerable for its actions and not take refuge in accusations that it is uniquely targeted with racism and discrimination. The point is that language is both the enabler of violent repression and its mask. How we deconstruct it as a weapon used against Palestinians and deploy it to craft a narrative promoting justice, human rights, historical truth, restitution, and reconciliation must be a priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for an amazing boiling down of a very complex book full of complex ideas. It is almost impossible to actually present this book in half an hour, but you've done it. And you've done it so well, and we all appreciate that. I hope many here have questions to pose to Tony. I asked people to write to me with their question, and I'll invite them one by one. There are 3 people already in the queue. Please raise your electronic hand. I think the first one did not share with me his question, but I will allow you to speak. John Yachisin, please unmute and ask your question. I suggest also before you start, John, that we have questions in batches of 3, and Tony take notes and answer them as after 3 were presented. John, please.
Hi, Chaim. Tony, it's been wonderful listening to you. I'm a, former citizen of the US who renounced over the issue of Palestinian rights and US unequivocal support for Israel. And I'm a person who frankly has always believed in Jewishness, even though quite frankly, I'm not a Jew. I'm simply someone who has many Jewish friends and who respects the religion immensely. I've always equated Jewishness with liberality and a fight for justice. And therefore, I found what has happened in this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism extremely difficult and painful, frankly. One of the questions, I guess the question I wanted to ask you, I support quite a number of organizations in the United States, knowing how important Jewish people in the U.S. are to the Israeli cause, that are questioning the prevailing narrative. One of them being, if not now. And I wonder to what degree you believe that organizations like that are actually beginning to really influence younger people to question this, what had been the traditional, what I describe as sort of the traditional, i.e. of the past several years narrative, that if you fail to support Israel, you are somehow anti-Semitic, whether or not that narrative is being broken by groups like that, and whether or not it is the case that in that sense, Jewish people are beginning to get back to the roots that are, to my mind at least, so critical to what is one of the great faiths. In other words, whether many more people are becoming mini Rabbi Hillels and as Alan Dershowitz has called Noam Chomsky, self-loathing Jews.
I invite David Cannon now to ask your question.
First of all, thanks for your presentation, Tony, and all you do. From all you say, it makes me wonder whether Israel actually thrives on anti-Semitism as it justifies its violent, racist suppression of pro-Palestinian sentiment. It also recruits Jewish immigrants. But my question is, does the danger of reducing such a layered term as Jew to a singularity imply the term itself is racist?
The next question, and the last one for this round, is from Tony Greenstein. Please, Tony, could you ask your question?
Hi, Tony. Good to hear you. The first impression I think you'd get if you read the IHRA is that it's so imprecise and unclear and written in obscure and uncertain language that you have to think that that was deliberate. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a byproduct of trying to get their concepts into language, but they actually deliberately set out to make it obscure and contradictory and confused. For example, if I quote from the opening 38-word definition of anti-Semitism, it says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews, which in itself raises a whole host of questions. Is anti-Semitism just a perception? If so, what is that perception? And if it may be expressed as hatred towards Jews, what else may it be expressed as? And I would just like to have your views on whether you think that was accidental or deliberate. I mean, given that the definition, as David Cannon has just said, is not only racist, but anti-Semitic, because it defines Jews as a collective, and as he said, a singularity. And the second thing I want to go on to is because the definition is extremely hard to defend in its own terms. I mean, there's no real attempt even to defend it. I was going to ask you whether you think this is an example of Marx's saying that the ruling ideas in society are the ideas of the ruling class. In other words, it almost has a material weight, which is beyond its own logic or lack of logic. Thanks.
Thank you. I think, Tony, it's all yours. 3 heavy questions.
Right. Let me get straight in then and try and tackle John's question. Of course, we're here. Well, I'm here in UK. I'm not in the United States. I do know something about the situation there, and there are encouraging things happening with some of these organizations, if not now in particular, also Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an organization I know very well. And I do get the feeling, talking to colleagues over there, that they are having a certain degree of success of the kind that you are quite rightly looking for. They, I think, have got the major Jewish organizations in America concerned, bothered. The rhetoric that they use against these new organizations, well, some of them are not so new, but the ones that are attracting younger people, the rhetoric they use against them has got a much more fierce in recent years, which suggests that they are worried. But I think that there is still a long way to go. And one of the problems, I think, in America, as it is here, I think it's more acute here in the United Kingdom, is that the opposition, that's to say the opposition to progressive Jewish thought on these matters, the opposition is very, very strong. And while one can point to points of breakthrough, the opposition is very effective at regrouping and finding ways to up their game, to find the right kind of words which demonize the kind of ideas that organizations like If Not Now are trying to encourage young people to understand and accept. And of course, well, the battles in the United States are very much on campuses, where there has been a very determined effort to apply IHRA, to get universities to apply it, and then to actually use it in order to chill freedom of speech in a very severe way. So there are a lot of challenges there. There are points of light, and you know, whether it's the Jewish people getting back to the roots, that's perhaps a slightly different question, a more philosophical one, which needs more time. David, well, I think in a way we're stuck with that word, and I think you know, there is a lot of talk, for example, around the problems with the word anti-Semitism and finding a new word for that, and Judeophobia is often suggested as one possibility. But I think the word Jew is so much part of culture in general that it's not so much that needs to be abolished, if you like. It is the fact that it implies many things. That if you look at the history of Judaism, the history of Jewish culture, there's immense varieties of Jewishness, many different ways that Jews have expressed that, and indeed today are carrying it on in an enormous variety of ways. So that seems to me to be much more important in this whole debate that we're having now about IHRA and so on, because the way we challenge the singularity that people who promote the IHRA sort of are stuck with or trying to promote is to push back by stressing just how diverse and just how multi-layered and multicultural itself is Jewish life and Jewish history, the Jewish past and the Jewish present. And then coming on to Tony's questions, deliberately obscure, probably, and certainly it is. Certainly that opening a paragraph, 38 words, I think it is, of the definition, you know, which virtually the same, both in its EUMC form and in the IHRA form, is stunningly meaningless. And of course, that serves a very useful purpose, because it means that anyone can say what they like about it. You can use it in any way you like. Certainly that paragraph and the definition itself, in the discussions that went on about it, and I know something about them, and they didn't go on for many years. They were actually relatively short. There was some effort to conceptualize it in a way that they thought would appeal as widely as possible, and the examples are clearly part of that, because they gave the definition and people using it an opportunity also to use it in whichever way they wanted to use it, and in particular in order to use it to freeze free speech on Israel-Palestine.
Thank you, Tony. And I'll now invite people in couples, because I think it takes you a long time to answer, and people need to remember the questions. So the next person is Moshe Machover. Please unmute.
Well, I want to join my preceding questioners or commenters in thanking Antony Lerman for this very enlightening and important discourse for his book, and beyond this, for the amazing journey that he has made from Zionism to being critical of it. Before my main point, I want to just make a historical point. Actually, I've come across much earlier mentions of the notion of new anti-Semitism. The earliest that I've come across dates from 1969, and it was used by Boaz Evron in a Hebrew article. Abba Ibn is also one of the earliest users or abusers of this terminology. But my main point is to question the discussion of this issue, and specifically of the power and the pernicious influence of the IHRA definition without looking at it in the broad international, global context of international politics. It seems to me that what makes it so damaging and so powerful is the fact that Israel is a special client of the world hegemon, the United States. If not, I think to a great extent, and it's becoming more and more evident that a positive attitude to Israel is a shibboleth of being a loyal camp-follower of the United States. And in this, it gives the notion of new anti-Semitism and IHRA definition or misdefinition an enormous power which it wouldn't have had not Israel been such an important player in the international constellation of US global hegemony.
And I now invite Ronald Rance to ask your question, please.
Yeah, Chaim, you've known me long enough to know that it's Roland, not Ronald.
Sorry, it's my mistake.
I was going to ask actually very much the same question or a similar question to Moshe's. We all know, and we've all dealt with the anti-Semitic argument that Jews control the world, that Jews control the media. And many of us have confronted the argument that the United States supports Israel because of the power of the Israel or the Jewish lobby. And we've argued against that the United States supports Israel because it's in the interests of the American ruling class, and that the Zionist lobby plays a useful part in that process. I think we're running a risk here of ignoring this crucial factor in the pattern that Tony has outlined in his introduction and in his book, which is they have been trying for decades to define opposition to Israel as anti-Semitic. I was banned from speaking at Manchester University in 1987 as the most evil anti-Semite ever to have spoken there. I know at the same time Tony Greenstone was being banned at campuses across the country. They've had minor successes, but they have never had the success that they've had in the past decade, because the power of the Jewish bodies and the Jewish institutions and the Israeli state on its own has not been enough to impose this discourse. I think what we have to see now is the growing integration of the Israeli state into the nexus of the far-right international, the fact that many of the most prominent supporters of the IHRA are states like Hungary and Poland, which themselves have a major anti-Semitism problem. I think if we look at it just in terms of the pressure, the undoubted pressure, and I mean, I understand and I agree with everything that Tony has said in his introduction, but that is not the only factor in consideration here. And I think there is a risk if we emphasize just this, of actually reinforcing this stereotype that it's Jews who run the world and that all these states are running around doing Israel's or Jews' bidding.
Thank you. Please, could you relate to those two related questions?
I have to apologize though, but I'm not hearing the questions very clearly. There's something going wrong with my reception, and so I'm kind of struggling to get the full gist. So I apologize if I'm not able to kind of answer them as fully as I should. I get this message coming up saying unstable connection. Anyway, I hope you can hear me. Certainly. And I think I can give fairly short answers to these questions because I fully agree with the point that Moshe made. And in fact, of course, I have a chapter in my book on geopolitics and, making, I think, exactly the same point that he makes about the fact that Israel has this geopolitical position, which enables it to persuade and to make sure that its allies are side with its own interpretation of the threat that it faces from global anti-Semitism. So I think that it's a very important point, and I'm happy Moshe raises it. And there's I hope, a good chapter in my book on that geopolitical aspect. And Ronald's point, I think, also is there in my book. I think you're right. It isn't. It is not correct, and it's not a good idea to be putting everything down to the Jewish lobby in America or elsewhere, to sort of local pro-Israel organizations. They are, of course, very important in this story, but, and again, as I say, I mentioned this and talk about it in my book, Israel's connections with authoritarian states are very important. They have been very important. They in recent years, they still are important. And that is, I think, a very significant factor in its ability to maintain this idea of itself as constantly under attack from anti-Semitism, which treats it as the collective Jew. So I think that both Moshe and Ronald's points are very important, and I hope that as I say, I've covered them in my book. And for those who haven't read the book, I urge them to read it, and they'll find what I think about it in there.
Thank you. And now I ask Mick Napier to relate his question.
The University College Union was taken to an employment tribunal by one of its members as being institutionally anti-Semitic, and they scored a crushing victory. We've seen council employees who've been fired from their jobs in London for discussing Israel and Palestine, who've won on other legal tribunals. I saw you actually on the most unpromising terrain of an Anglican tribunal, the Tory party on its knees, changed the whole nature of the discussion with your presentation. And some of us up here in Scotland have been subjected to criminal prosecutions for alleged anti-Semitism, and won. Would you agree, my question is, would you agree that not only is the IHRA not fit for purpose by any general assessment, but in terms of prosecuting pro-Palestine activists, it cannot be used, or it can actually be defeated fairly easily on any level playing field where it can be critiqued and interrogated and criticised by one of my learned friends. So therefore, it has serious limitations if people intend to defy it and bring it onto some sort of legal or paralegal platform.
Before I invite Jan Dekkers to ask a question, I want to point out that we only had men asking questions. So all you ladies out there, please see this as pressure to come in. Can you please ask your question, Jan Dekkers?
I'll try to be brief. So my background is in philosophy, and once upon a time I studied the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas quite a bit. And I know that there's quite a lot of traction in philosophy departments around the world on the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. So I wondered whether Anthony knew whether the Levinas scholars, which seem to be existing in quite great numbers, are engaging with this discussion of anti-Semitism at all, because I must say that I'm quite ignorant of this myself. And thank you very much for your brilliant introduction to the book. I learned a lot from it.
Tony, can you relate to those two?
Yeah, sure. Again, I can think fairly brief on both of them. Perhaps I'll just take the second one first. Although I have dabbled in philosophy for this book, I wouldn't for 1 minute pose as a philosophy student or a philosophy expert. So I'm afraid, although I have read some Levinas, and I think there are things in Levinas which are relevant to this discussion, unfortunately, I'm not the one to be able to answer your question as to whether followers of Levinas or people reading him are engaging in this. One will have to find someone else to answer that. Mick's point is a very good one, I think, because as he and I know, at the tribunal that we attended of Stephen, of the Anglican Stephen Sizer, who was accused of bringing his order into disrepute because of anti-Semitism. The legal argument that was used, although there has been no judgment yet in this case, was clearly, I think, for those of us there, very, very effectively put. And therefore, I do think that while I do think that if it's challenged, if IHRA is challenged, or things associated with it are challenged in a legal framework, there are good possibilities for pushing back against it. There was the tribunal in 2013 involving the university's union that was being accused of anti-Semitism, and that case was definitively lost, and very embarrassing for the people who brought it, the people who defended the organization, the man who was running the organization, Academic Friends of Israel. So I think that yes, the law could be on the side of those pushing back against IHRA, not only on the side of those who want to use it in order to chill freedom of speech by Palestinians and their supporters.
There are indeed two ladies lined up to ask questions. The first one is Ronit Lentin. Please unmute.
Thank you very much, Tony, for a brilliant presentation of the book. I definitely will read it now. What my question is, because I'm interested in the centrality of race, is the anti-Semitism campaign, which we are seeing now being waged, not only by Israel Friends, but by all sorts of players, not really a proxy for the centrality of the ongoing centrality of race and white supremacy, and for the racialization of non-whites, but particularly of Muslims and migrants? I'm kind of putting it very succinctly. I don't want to give a speech. Thank you.
Sorry, could you just repeat it? The sound went just.
Okay.
No.
Is the anti-Semitism campaign not really a proxy for the ongoing centrality of race and of the racialization of non-whites, and particularly of Muslims and migrants, which we are seeing at the moment?
Right. Okay, I got that.
Okay, and then Sue King, would you please ask your question?
So my interest in this is because I've been with EAPPI in the West Bank, and I have to do presentations about my experiences there. So what I'm interested in is how to make sure when I'm speaking to an audience, I'm not being anti-Semitic, and if somebody accuses me of it, that I can confidently respond to the criticism. I am usually very careful, by the way. So you've mentioned the two definitions, the IHRA and also the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. I'd be grateful if you could say a little bit about what you think the difference is between them and how widely used each one is. And then, any kind of practical tips on how to respond to an accusation of anti-Semitism. It was interesting to hear you say before that a legal challenge could probably be successful because it's also vague. So what is the best and friendliest and easiest way to respond to an accusation of anti-Semitism, either based on these definitions or not? Thank you.
So Ronit, again, I think I can answer this quite simply in that I agree with you. I think that that it is a proxy for the ongoing racialization of others. I wouldn't say it's only that. I would say it is also that. But fundamentally, I agree with the point that you make. And Sue, well, in a way, you're kind of asking, and I think quite rightly and quite fairly, for there to be some kind of seminar in which the question that you ask, how can one respond when one is being accused of anti-Semitism in the kind of circumstances that you find yourself? How can how should one react? How should one push back against that kind of criticism? So I think that is a kind of wider discussion. Certainly, in terms of the two definitions, there is no question which one is quote unquote better. And that is the Jerusalem Declaration against anti-Semitism. And certainly, in I think the circumstances that you personally find yourself in, the arguments, the content of that definition should be useful because it is very much focused on quite clearly stating, sort of in absolute terms, that that discourse which characterizes Palestinians as anti-Semitic is entirely wrong and unacceptable, and it gives reasons for it there. So if it's simply a matter of wanting a text which helps with that particular point and that particular issue you're facing, then certainly the Jerusalem Declaration is the one you want, because the IHRA is clearly doing exactly the opposite, which is legitimizing the kind of discourse where people like you and others will be accused of anti-Semitism because of what they might be saying about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Having said that, I have always, from the very beginning, when the EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism, which is the forerunner of the IHRA, and there's not much difference between the two, when that came out itself in 2005, I was critical of it from the very beginning for all kinds of reasons. One, because taken together, and it's supposed to be taken together, the whole thing is over 500 words. And that, to me, doesn't make a definition. I don't think you can have a definition which is 500 words long. So I've always been against that definition and long definitions. We don't need long definitions. They just obscure, they just confuse. And one of the problems with the JDA is that I think that it is also long. Now, to be perfectly fair, the JDA, the people who produce it, insist very clearly that it's the first paragraph which is the definition, and the rest of it is informative and explanatory and so on. The IHRA definition is structured the same way. There's what's appears to be a short definition and then examples, but the IHRA allow it to be said that the whole thing is the definition and it has to be used together. If you try and change it in any way, then it's not the definition anymore. So there is this difference between the two, but I personally feel that these long definitions are not helpful, and it would be better for there to be a short definition which can be used in legal cases, which is quite clear, which doesn't try and do too much, and there are some of those around. And if you look up, for example, the work of a good friend of mine, an academic, Brian Klug, then in his work on this, he's done a lot of work on definitions. He offers some kinds of definitions which you might find useful in the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Tony. And we're coming towards the end. I want to use the position as chair to ask a question, if I may, which relates to the last two, which I think are important questions. We heard just yesterday from an important body that monitors racism in Britain that Islamophobia has become very rampant, as if it wasn't before this report, but that monitoring events and types of Islamophobia has made Muslims living in the UK second-class citizens. Now, far be it from me to argue that real anti-Semitism, not the IHRA type, but old anti-Semitism doesn't exist. But frankly, it's definitely not the most rampant form of racism. So first of all, we have now two well-known, long and complex definitions of anti-Semitism. We don't have anything like that on Islamophobia, on hatred towards racism towards Black people, etc. So yet anti-Semitism is probably the smallest racism now active in the UK. So first, do we really need a definition if we don't need it in the case of Black people? And secondly, how do we take real anti-Semitism and put it in the zoo of racism, because it's now outside of that zoo. It doesn't belong with all the other racism. It's supposedly more important than any other form of racism, where in reality, this is not the case.
I agree very much that we need to be very cautious about what we say about the threat of the threat of anti-Semitism in this country. It has as we know, I think also from what's emerged about what's been going on in the Labour Party with this hierarchy of racism that was reported by the Ford report, in which clearly anti-Semitism is placed at the top of that hierarchy, and everything else seems to be getting ignored. And this is appalling and unjustified, and clearly doesn't help Jews, and it certainly doesn't help those minorities that are being pushed down the ladder, so to speak, because their concerns aren't being taken into account. One of the problems here, though, is that, of course, we're stuck with these definitions now. They're like elephants in the room, or actually, they're worse than that. They're there, and we have to confront them. But I think what I'm trying to offer in my book, which is a deconstruction of discourses and narratives which use simple language, is one way sort of around all of that, because we should also, in our arguments and our critiques, be able to find the same kind of language which can appeal to people and reach them without it being too complex. They should be able to have the same kind of impact that people have achieved with new anti-Semitism and the discourse around that. We should be able to present simple, catchy language which people can immediately understand why that is not the right way, and why there is another way when it comes to dealing with anti-Semitism. And we certainly should not be prioritizing anti-Semitism over other forms of racism. And I think that indeed, if we're looking for ways forward in this whole mess, working with other groups, working to fight anti-Semitism within the context of racism is absolutely essential. And that doesn't mean Jews coming along and saying, we know how to do it and this is the way you do it. This means coming together with each with their own particular circumstances, because there are different circumstances for Muslims, there are different circumstances for Black people, different circumstances for Jews. And yes, we need to acknowledge, if people can come together, that they're not all of the same seriousness, and that is important, because if we can't gauge and measure exactly what's going on and honestly discuss that between such groups, then we won't get anywhere. So there has to be a lot of reality, a lot of honesty. But I think that ultimately the only way forward, the only way out of this mess that we've got with anti-Semitism, is ultimately to be working with other groups in order to have all that we are experiencing in terms of negativity and racism exposed, but not to exaggerate. Not, for example, sometimes I hear of people who say that the anti-Semitism that we Jews experience now in this country, that we are oppressed. Well, I really don't believe that the word oppressed is a word that should be applied to the situation of the Jews in this country. It simply is not accurate by any means. So we need to be careful, but I do think the way forward is to come together with other groups. So I think you sort of colorful language that you used about the zoo of racism, but of course, none of us want to be in the zoo of racism. We want to get out of the zoo, and we want to be as free as we can be with our own identities and our own cultures, but mixing them as well, and that has to be the way forward.
Thank you very, very much, Tony, for an hour and a half of your precious time of giving us a picture of the the book, but also answering questions so well. I hope all of you who haven't read the book yet will do so, because the book is so much more rich and complex that anyone, including Tony, can present in half an hour. It's a hall of mirrors of issues which are railing our society and rocking it. And I think that the importance that he gives to the silencing of debate on Palestine is in every single chapter, almost in every single page, there is a reference to that as the real target of the IHRA definition. And we should continue to deal with the IHRA, but we should not leave the debate about freedom of Palestine and Palestinians. And I think Tony does that in the book all the time. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for being with us for this session. And I want to say that the next session is of a new book by Tony Greenstein on the 13th of November, a book which relates in many ways to the arguments that we heard today. And I hope you will all join. We shall send an invite over the next week, and I hope to see you there. Thank you all very, very much, especially Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you all.